meeting you right where you are on your foster care journey. This is the Forgotten Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Forgotten Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Cabe, and I am so happy to be with you. If you are part of the foster care community, passionate about serving, or simply interested in learning more, we are here for you. In every episode of this podcast, you will hear stories from men and women who have experienced foster care to one degree or another. They may have grown up in the system, are caseworkers, foster parents, or others who are here to bring you hope or encouragement. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe and share it with a friend. And remember, you are not alone. I hope you enjoy the Forgotten Podcast. Well, Tim, truly thank you for being on the show today. I'm very excited to talk with you and appreciate your willingness to share your story and your perspective. And today we're going to talk about some heavy stuff, but not without hope, right? And we're going to talk to the one particularly, I think, the one who is struggling right now through loss, through grief, but also to the one who loves someone who is struggling. And for you, 2020 was a year marked by some significant loss. And would you just share some of your story with us?
Certainly, yeah. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. In 2020, my son Nick was a student at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and newly engaged to a delightful young lady and making plans for the future and ready to press on. He had the hope of returning to Canada. He had gone to the States for his training, but hoped to return to Canada and just pastor a small church. That was his hope and desire. But on November 3rd of 2020, he just very suddenly collapsed, and he was playing a game with some friends. He was off campus, away from any kind of medical equipment or anything else. He collapsed, and nobody could revive him. And so he went to be with the Lord. And the first we knew about it was just a couple of text messages from people who were there and concerned and weren't quite sure what was happening. But then the real defining moment was the call from the doctor, who just had to pass along the news and say, I assure you we did everything we could, but unfortunately he's gone. So that entered us into this season of sorrow, if you will, that I write about in the book.
I can't not even imagine. I can't imagine. And I am so sorry for that, for what you've gone through.
Yeah, thank you.
We have our daughter, our oldest daughter, is also just graduated high school a couple of years ago. And I connect with just the season that he was in versus the season that she's in. And it's not the way it was supposed to be, right? It doesn't feel like it's the way it was supposed to be.
No, exactly. And it's usually just such a joyous season. As they graduate high school, they go on to college, they're beginning to discover who they are apart from mom and dad and starting to really build out their plans and dreams and desires and starting to get going in independent life. And so it came as a total shock to us. Of course, we had no knowledge of anything wrong with him, no idea that this ever could or would happen.
What do you do? What do you do in those moments when you first hear, what is that like?
Yeah, it's nothing you can really prepare yourself for, in the sense that when it comes with such a sense of shock and just such a sense of disbelief. And that was really it. I went so far as to have the doctor repeat a certain sentence. I said, I need you to say these words. Your son, Nicholas Paul Challies, is no longer alive, or something along those lines. There's just such a sense of unreality. And yet immediately a sense of confidence in the Lord that, being Christians and having spent a lot of time just studying the character of God and the nature of God and just affirming our relationship with him, we had a deep sense that God was in this in some way, that somehow, in some mysterious way, this too was part of God's will for Nick and even part of God's will for our lives. So even though there was all that shock and deep grief and sorrow and uncertainty, we were never without any sense of hope or purpose in it, for which I'm just so thankful.
Yeah. And that is so true of the character of our God, is he never leaves us nor forsakes us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And immediately just this deep sense of God being with us in our sorrows, that we knew he had never abandoned us or forsaken us, and very quickly learned that all of his promises are true, that God, in our sorrows, God will be true to his every promise. It was just such a precious realization to us.
Wow. When you started to walk, I mean, the journey of healing, like, how does that even start? How does that even look? I mean, can you just kind of walk us through some of what that journey looks like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very uneven journey with lots of taking steps backward and so on. But I think most people who have gone through any kind of loss would know that at the beginning you wonder if you'll make it. And by the end you realize, no, we can go on with life. We will smile again. We will find joy again. And there's sort of this transition from the old normal to the new normal. And that takes time, and it takes different amounts of time depending on your relationship to the person who's gone, depending on your own makeup, just the way you relate to the world around you, relate to other people. And then I think also just your role in that person's life, in terms of a mom is going to process it very differently from a dad, just having been the one who carried that child in her body and who nursed him and all that. There's just a different form of connection between a son and a father, and a son and a mother, and so on. So we learned that in the way we speak of love languages, and that's pretty common parlance among Christians, there really are grief languages as well, just different ways we grieve. And then that just puts such an onus on all of us to be so patient and kind and forbearing with other people, to allow them to grieve in their own way and not insist that they grieve in our way. And so, looking back after a couple of years, I think I can say that all of us, that's my two girls and my wife and myself and Nick's fiance, who's really just become part of our family, we've all grieved in different ways, but I think we're all doing well, and all are starting to live in that new normal where we realize, we're gonna go on. We're accepting this burden. We're gonna take it, and we're gonna do something with it. We're gonna honor and serve the Lord with it.
Wow. Is acceptance a huge piece of it? Acceptance that this is real? Like you mentioned, you said accepting this burden.
Yeah, I think acceptance is a huge part of it, but I would say my experience is not so much acceptance in terms of denying that it ever happened, but acceptance in the form of submission, just accepting that this is somehow part of God's will. This is somehow part of God's plan. If we can admit to this common ground that God is the one ultimately who gives life, and God is the one ultimately who recalls life, that somehow matters of life and death are within God's hands, then all I know how to do is to accept this as his will, and then to bow the knee to him in submission, and just say, you can do no wrong, God. You are good and holy and true and loving and kind. All these things I've always known about you must be true in this. You haven't stopped being loving. You haven't stopped being good. You haven't stopped working all things through your will. And so we must therefore accept that this is your plan for Nick and your plan for us. And so instead of rebelling or shaking our fists at the sky, we'll just say, we might not see it now, but we're trusting, and we're going to go on believing that you have done something good.
Wow. Talk more about the grief languages. What are some ways you process versus others?
Yeah, so I think most of us have that category of internal versus external processors, and we very much saw that in our family. And then I'm sort of an external writing processor, so I don't want to talk to people a whole lot, but I want to work it out on the written page. Aileen is more of an internal processor. I think she didn't write. She didn't talk to too many people about it. She just had to work it out very slowly and in small pieces. And, I want to say that I think as the mom, I don't know how much value there is in comparing griefs, but I just think the mom probably carries the heaviest load of all, just with the way God has wired us, men and women and moms and dads and all of that. I think it's taken her a little bit longer to really come to that new normal, but I think that's to be expected as the mom. And then my daughters, I think had to talk about it a little bit more and worked it out. One even with the help of a counselor who was tremendously helpful and really, really just helped her through it in wonderful ways. And so all of us differently. And again, I think the key is to just be patient with one another and not just so put ourselves at the center of the world that we think my way of processing grief is the right way. So if you're slower, I need you to hurry up. Or if you're too fast, I'm going to judge you as if, well, maybe you didn't love them as much as I did or something. Yeah. We just have to be so patient and kind.
Which makes so much sense that grief would be no different than the way we love, the way we process, the way all the things that we need to forbear with one another and be patient. I think that's really important. For you, you mentioned writing is a really helpful way to process your grief. I also love to process through writing. I journal every day. Like I often think I don't know what I feel unless I write it or speak it. I'm a processor, so out loud processor. So I can speak it. I remember one time talking to my husband and I was going, and he kind of looked at me and goes, "I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention." And I'm like, "It's okay. I got everything I needed. You were just there. I just needed to hear myself say it." But tell me more about how you have processed and how writing has helped you.
Yeah. So all throughout life, or really adult life anyways, writing has been my form of thinking or even my form of meditation. So, as believers, we understand we need to read God's word, but we also need to meditate upon it, which is just really chewing on it and letting those truths sink deep down and start to change our thoughts, change our beliefs, change our behavior. And for me, writing has been the way I do that. And I think that's partly because I have a mind that moves quickly, but a memory that's really bad. And so unless I put ideas down, I can type quickly, I can get them out quickly. Unless I put them down, they're just gone. I was really helped once. I was on a panel at a conference with quite an eminent theologian, and somebody asked us a question about a point of theology. And it made me so happy to see him pull out his iPad and look at a sermon he had preached on that to remind himself what he believes about that point of theology. And I thought, okay, so I'm not the only one here who has to go back to what I've written and sort of establish this canon of what I believe. I can go back and consult it. And so as I was processing this grief, this loss, I had to write it down to just get those thoughts out in an orderly fashion. And so I could return to them. And I didn't understand at the time that this was going to become a book. It took several months before I even began to really think about that. But I'm glad I wrote that down because in its own way, it's now become a real-time journey of grief. As we look back on things, they're different. A lot of the urgency of situations is gone, or you have a bad memory like I do, you forget a lot of the details. So grief 10 years later is much more mature, but it also loses a lot of that urgency. And so I'm really thankful I wrote it down just for that reason, because it is in that sense real time.
Absolutely. I connect also with that. I remember one time going through a very hard time where there were some things being said about me that I started to believe that weren't true. And I remember having to go back to my journals and seeing the prayers I had prayed to God. And it actually, I got to see where I was and how I was feeling and my heart in that moment. And I was like, okay, so I know the truth now of where I actually was versus what is being said. And that was very helpful to me.
Yeah, no, I very much resonate with that. There's been times in life apart from this where I've written things down and returned to it later and had forgotten the context or forgotten the urgency or forgotten the depth of the emotion I was feeling. And it really was helpful to be able to go back to that moment and not sort of, as we look back on time, we tend to compress things too. So they happen much sooner. Rather than really feeling sometimes how long it was between events or how long we felt or believed one thing before our minds were changed.
Right. Yeah. Because once that perspective changes, it's like we're all in on that thought and it makes sense, but we don't remember all the ups and downs that led to get to that thought. Yeah. That's good. What are some ways, and as you've written this book, as you've talked to people through your own grief, if I'm assuming you've talked to a lot of people as you've been able to share your story. I'm guessing lots of people have shared their story with you as well. What are some ways to process that you have heard or seen? Obviously, you've talked about the writing, but other ways to process grief in a healthy way, a way that leads to healing.
Yeah, I think ultimately we need to process our grief theologically, which means we're processing it with an awareness of who God is. And if we can keep in mind the character of God, just acknowledging that God is a loving and kind Father, that his character is good, that his heart is inclined toward us, then we've got the building blocks in place to begin to move from there and then interpret our circumstances through the character of God. I'm so thankful that I had been raised in a family that valued sound doctrine. And so I had been taught a lot about the character and the work of God. And so I had those pieces in place before I went through this. You wouldn't want your time of grief to be the moment you're starting to ask those questions. Well, who is this God? And what is this God like? And is he good? Is he sovereign? Can Satan sneak around God's defenses and pull things over on him that God didn't see coming or God wasn't aware of? That if you can really get these things down in the good times, then you're ready to draw upon them and enact them in the bad times. And so I think what we realized was our moment of deep grief was the moment God was calling us just to enact that theology, as in, okay, you've got this doctrine. What are you going to do with it? How's it going to serve you in this moment? It served you well when everything was going your way anyways. And, God's will just seemed to be so closely aligned with mine anyways. But now here's this thing you didn't want. What are you going to do? How's that going to sit with you now? And unfortunately, I think this is where so many people throw their faith away. They haven't really prepared themselves for suffering and for sorrow. And so when that comes then, and they don't have a good assessment of who God is, they haven't really gone deep in the Word to say, well, this is God, then they're simply not prepared to suffer. And then I think the other thing I would say is to just be so careful to make sure we're doing doctrine before we're doing emotion, or allowing truth to affect our emotions and not the other way around. So in those moments of deep sorrow where we feel things and we're tempted to just follow those emotions to their logical conclusion, but we have to go to something that's more trustworthy, which is the truth that God reveals in his word. And then as much as we can, that doesn't mean we don't feel, but it just means we feel rightly. As much as we can, we allow truth to guide our emotions.
Wow. What do you think about, or how do you kind of know when maybe you're processing, but you're starting to spiral, maybe get stuck, and maybe even those feelings are driving you more towards bitterness as opposed to becoming better, to becoming, to bringing it back to God? How do you know when that's happening, and what do we do to avoid that?
Yeah. And this is where I think Christian friends or pastors are such a gift to us. And I say I processed largely through the written word, but I did have friends who were involved in my life and who were inquiring of me, and, wife and family as well. And I think they would have been the ones to say, you're not sounding so good right now, or there is this kind of bitterness creeping up in your tone or in your voice. So we were looking for that, and just very aware we could have to fight that tendency. But then also, if you just can't do normal life. And so, in the early days, you can't do much of anything, and that's okay. That's to be expected. There's a real fog or darkness that settles upon so many people early in grief. But after a sufficient period of time of, weeks or a couple of months, if you're still not able to function, I think that's where we had spoken to some counselors early just to say, what should we look for? And that was really one of them. If you can't function, you're not able to do normal life things, then that's probably a good time to speak to a pastor, and maybe your pastor would direct you to a counselor, someone who's just trained in addressing those thoughts and helping you work them through. And again, I want to say we've seen such value in Christian counseling through this situation, especially as it pertains to one of my girls, just working this through and doing it under the guidance of someone who's specially trained in how to what to look for and what truths to apply to that.
Yeah. I mean, this is not something we can do or as it doesn't help to do it alone, right?
No.
Which makes it so much harder for people who don't feel like they have anyone to go to.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So having a friend, or again, relying on pastors, and, people probably won't ever give us all the help we want them to, because people have their own lives. And for the first few weeks, of course, people surround you and you have lots of support, but the support networks pretty quickly dry up, and most people won't stick with you for that long, which again is understandable. And certainly through this, we've had to look at our own lives and say, how often did we abandon people before they were really ready to get back to life? But just relying on pastors and being willing to speak to somebody and say, I just need to talk, or I just need to get together, I think is absolutely crucial.
Yeah. Which can be so difficult, right? To reach out when you're struggling, and yet it is important. And go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things that we learned is very, very helpful is for somebody, a good friend, to say something like, I will never grow tired of your grief, or I will be here as long as you need to. If you ever need to talk about that, just give me a call. I won't resent it. I won't be upset by it. I won't roll my eyes about it. I'll be here for you. Not everyone can do that. But if you have one or two trusted friends who can just make themselves available, and then they can inquire as well. But as much as anything, just, I will always be here for you. You can rely on me. Oh, it's just such a blessing to know you've got that person, and you can reach out and they won't resent it.
I think that's huge. And that actually kind of goes right into what I wanted to ask you next, because I think as people who are walking with people in grief or seeing someone grieving, it can be difficult to know what to say. We can all too often, I know you talk about this too, we can all too often think, well, I don't want to say anything that will offend or hurt more, so I'm just going to not say anything, or I'm going to just back away. And it's not out of unlove. It's not because I don't love you. It's because I don't know how to love you. And so then sometimes we think nothing is better than the wrong thing. And I think that you would say that's not necessarily true, right? That something is better than nothing. Talk more about like how we as friends and support people can lean in instead of pull back.
So let me just deal first with the person who has been grieved. And I would say, in that moment, do your utmost not to be petty or not to be easily offended. And just if somebody brings sort of ham-fisted encouragement, just take it as encouraging as you can, and God bless them. At least they're trying. And really, I think it's either that or grow bitter. And, bitterness is already such a temptation. Why not just receive it as much encouragement as you can, and just press on. But turning it around, I would say I've come to a deeper awareness that our culture, modern 21st century Western culture, is not good at this. And I live in a very multicultural context. I've traveled a fair bit. I know there's other cultures that are far better. They know what to do. They still have ways of responding to tragedy, and we've really lost it. And so sending a text message to sympathize with somebody in deep grief may be fine if you're quite peripheral to them. But that almost seems to be the default now, to just send a text message and say, hey, really sorry, thinking about you. That's not the worst thing to do, but at least if you're close to the person, there's something so important about being physically present or doing something tangible. And so in the early days, you have to remember that people are probably quite incapacitated by their grief, and simple things become hard. So cooking, shopping, those sorts of things, caring for kids, getting kids to school. These are all very tangible physical things you can reach out and take care of, whether that's, Uber Eats gift cards, or whether that's bringing a hot meal at 5 or 6 p.m. These are just really good ways of caring for people. And then as time goes on, they'll hopefully be able to function a little bit more. And that's where you can maybe step back, but still be available. I think most people want to talk more rather than less about the loved one who's died. And so you feel like, well, if I talk about them, I'm going to make them sad. No, they're already sad. You're not going to make them sad. And if they cry, that's not even necessarily a bad thing. The great fear is that our loved one will be forgotten, almost like they never existed. So by bringing up memories and sharing fun stories or sharing precious experiences you had together, that can be a big blessing rather than just backing off. And I think as well, just occasionally saying, how are you doing? Under the circumstances, how are things going? If they don't want to talk about it, just don't press. It'll probably be pretty obvious through body language or through something else. But I think most people do want to talk about it and are just relieved if that awkwardness is taken off the table and we can just talk about it. So I know for us, we stood in front of the church a few weeks after Nick died and just talked to the church and said, thank you, of course, for all your love and care, but also please talk about Nick. We don't ever think you'll be offending us or harming us in any way. Talk about him. Let's keep his memory alive. And thankfully the church has done that.
I love that. Tim, would you tell us a little bit about Nick?
Yeah. Well, Nick was our firstborn child. He was born about 3 years after we got married. And so I've never really known adult life without him. I married young and very quickly Nick came into the picture. So he was just a sweet boy and a kind boy and one who not always, but generally wanted to do what was right. He never went through that bad or rebellious phase. He was terrified of doing bad stuff. And so he just tried to be a good kid. When he was 10 or 12 years old, somewhere in there, he really had to grapple with spiritual matters and decided he wanted to follow the Lord. And I think he was baptized at 13 or so into our church, became a member and served there faithfully. And then as he got a little bit older, we started to think about college. He just really realized that he felt the Lord was calling him to ministry. And so he went off to Boyce College in Louisville, Kentucky. And that's where he really, I think, found himself in the sense that he had to get away from mom and dad to really figure out who he was. And he gained a kind of self-confidence there, especially when he wooed this lovely young lady and she said yes to him. That really put a bit of, really straightened his spine a little bit. And, he was just on so many good trajectories in life and just inexplicable to us that the Lord took him. And yet, what have we been able to do but say, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. And so blessed be the name of the Lord.
Wow. Wow. Sounds like a wonderful kid.
He was. And that's my favorite question is tell me about Nick.
Aww. I can totally understand what you're saying. I mean, I wouldn't want to stop talking about my kid.
Right. Right. And maybe people think that when somebody dies, you stop loving them, but the opposite is true. You love them even more because I think a couple of things happen. One, just, absence makes the heart grow fonder. So, it's a cliche, but it is true. Yeah. But the other thing is after people die, you forget about all the bad things typically. Yeah. And so all that's left is the things you loved about that person, honored about that person. That just causes the heart to swell with love all the more. And so, that person is maybe especially when you're a Christian and that person was a Christian as well, there's a sense of nearness you have to that person where you think we're not that far apart.
What a day that will be, right? When you get that reunion.
Yeah.
Wow.
Can't wait.
Do you feel like have you ever heard from people like maybe who haven't gone through the loss of a child, but they're going through something, they're grieving something? I mean, a lot of people who listen to this podcast are foster parents, and maybe they have loved a child and sent that child home. And they're grieving because they love that child, even though they want that child to have reunification, or maybe there's someone who's lost a relationship because they've, had just hard situations that have broken that. Do you ever have people who feel like my grief isn't big enough? I shouldn't feel this way, almost like a guilt, like, well, I don't like downplaying themselves. Have you had that?
Yeah. One of the things we like to hear least, and we've talked about this, is when people say something like, and I know it's nothing like what you guys have gone through. And, if somebody has a hangnail and they're acting as if they've lost a loved one, you want to, you have to put these things in some context. On the other hand, I think all of these losses push us beyond our natural ability. And so it doesn't really matter whether it's returning a foster child that you had really grown to love, or whether it's laying a child in the grave. They really, really hurt. And it doesn't make it any better to pretend that it's otherwise, or to say, well, because this person lost a child, it shouldn't hurt, or it should, I might be feeling something wrong, or it might be wrong of me to grieve because I'm returning this child I love. So I think there's, somewhere between these two, we do have to contextualize these things. And it's a sign of immaturity, I think. It's little children who scream and cry about, they spilled their milk or something, and they act as if the world has ended.
Right.
So we do need some maturity. On the other hand, these things really, really do hurt, and we're not stoics. And, God has not called us just to grit our teeth and bear these things. Jesus Christ himself stood outside the tomb of his friend, and he wept. And if the Son of God himself experienced sorrows and pains, he knew this man was about to rise from the dead too. He still experienced this sorrow and this pain and truly wept. So should we. And it is a good and holy thing to weep, because it's simply admitting what's true about this world, which is it's broken and it hurts, and we're longing for the end of all this sorrow and pain, and we're just crying out in our grief, Christ, come quickly, just bring an end to all of this. Deliver us from our sorrows, deliver us from our griefs. So
because one day in heaven we will have no more tears, no more pain.
Right. And all these things will be made right. That's the other part of it, is somehow we'll look back on all of this and say, God did well. Somehow we don't see it yet. But, the metaphor that you've heard often, I guess Corrie ten Boom maybe popularized it, but God is weaving this tapestry, and all we see today is the bottom side with all the knots, and it's just a bare outline of something. But someday God will turn it over, and we'll see what he's been doing, and it'll just leave us all in awe, just saying, you did well. You did far beyond what we could ask or even imagine. And so as much as we can to just place our faith in that, to place our faith in God and in his promises, then to live in that future as much as we can, or to put our faith there and now live backwards, saying it will all be made right. So somehow even this will be made right. Somehow even this will be declared to be good and part of God's good plan. I don't see it now, but I can take it by faith.
Yeah. And being honest in that way. I don't see it. I don't understand it. I don't want it, but I trust.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's exactly what faith is, right? The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. We don't see these things now, and we can't see them now, but we really can trust. And I think God really rewards that faith. And that's where the joy comes in, right? There's not a lot of joy in our current circumstances, but so we look ahead to joy, and we start to borrow joy from the future. It's just like you're pulling it from heaven to earth and saying, I'm going to experience that joy now, because I know it will be made right, and I know God will make good on it.
I love that. What you gave some things that people could say. You mentioned like how friends say your grief will never, is never too much for me, or things like that. Are there other sorts of things that would be helpful to hear from someone who is grieving?
Yeah. What Christians alone can offer is truth. And so anyone can come and say, hey, I'll talk to you anytime you want. Anyone can bring you a nice warm lasagna. But Christians alone can gain the mind of God and speak those truths. We have access to the word. And so we can bring those deep scriptural truths to bear. And, it's not always the time to bring every Christian truth. You don't want to wade right into somebody's deepest sorrow and maybe bring Romans 8:28. There's a time and there's a place for that. But there's some Psalm 23. It's always the right time for Psalm 23. Just that wonderful truth that the Lord is my shepherd, and that even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. So even when we're in our deepest sorrow, the shepherd's right there. In fact, the shepherd's one who led us into that dark valley, because he's taking us to all the wonders on the other side. And so being able to bring those truths, I think is just such a precious ministry. So when somebody's deep in sorrow, I think we need to understand God's got this sacred calling on us in that moment to enter into their life, to enter into their pain, and to represent Him. Because in all likelihood, God's not going to send an angel. In all likelihood, God's not going to speak from the sky. In all likelihood, Jesus won't come, incarnate Himself, and give you a hug. But He's got His people who are His body, who will come and perform those tasks. And when we do it, it's really no different than God Himself doing it. And we as Christians should both give and respond in that way. We're representing the Lord Himself. And so it's a wonderful sacred ministry you take upon yourself when you go to that person and just seek to honor and serve the Lord in it.
And we know God draws near to the sufferer. And so when we draw near to the sufferer, like you're saying, we're also going to experience more of God, more of Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. We get to do His work. And what a blessing that God involves us in His work. I mean, we talk about that often in things like evangelism, sharing the gospel. You know, God could change people's hearts just in an instant without any human intervention. Instead, He gives the task to us, right? Go and make disciples. And it's the same thing with comfort. And God truly does comfort us by His Spirit, working through the Word without human intervention. But how much more does He come into people's lives through His people and bring them comfort and blessings that way? And so we take that upon ourselves as something really precious from the Lord, which then puts the burden on us, I think, to do it well, to really seek to represent Him.
Yeah. Two things come to mind. I remember a time when I was deeply struggling with something, and I reached out to a friend and just said, "Can we talk?" And she was like, "I'm actually out near your house right now. I'll come to you." And I remember her showing up at my front door and opening that door and seeing her there. And I just wept. And I just hugged her, and she held me in her arms just as I cried and cried and cried. And it meant so much. You know, just to be like, you're willing to get into my mess with me. And where I'm not able to give you anything except my grief. It's so beautiful. I mean, I think what you're saying is we can be that for people. I mean, I will forever be grateful to her for that. I think of another time with one of my teenage sons who is not a hugger. And I remember standing in my kitchen. We're going through a tough time and crying. I do a lot of crying, Tim. I'm a feeler.
All good.
But I remember crying, and all of a sudden I just felt his arms around me. And that was very unusual for him. And I looked at him and I saw him and I said, "Oh," and I just started crying harder because I was like, this is not his normal. This is, and I looked at him and I said, "You are being Jesus to me." I think he was kind of like, whoa. But it means so much.
It does. It's deeply affecting when people reach out in that way and when they just want to comfort us in our sorrows. It's such a blessing, and one of the ways God really cares for us. So if we're asking for God to be present in our sorrows, I truly do think we can expect that God will He'll be with us by His Spirit. You know, He'll communicate truths right within us that will be precious and sustain us. But we also need to look for how He'll provide outwardly. And in my assessment, after, really just through all of my life, God's perfectly capable of using miracles, but He doesn't seem to do that very often. And in my life, I can't think of any time I've witnessed something miraculous, but I would never want to disparage providence with God just arranging circumstances so that person is in your neighborhood. And so she does have opportunity to drop by your house. And so you can't just throw yourself into her arms. And just think of all the pieces God has had to arrange for that one little circumstance to be able to happen.
Right.
And you think, I don't need miracles. I've got this. And this is God's way of caring for me.
Yes. Yes. And I think I know that there's been times in my life I have said, "Lord, will you please show up through your people to me today?" Can you, and He has. And there's times that He does it in a different way, but it's okay to ask, right? Reach out, ask the Lord, like big hopes, big dreams, big expectations of our God.
Absolutely. And I think we also then need to reverse that and say, God, can I be the answer to somebody's prayer today? So
Amen.
if we're heading off, especially on a Sunday where the church is gathering, and we're saying, God, I'm open to your providence today. Use me to bring encouragement to someone. Man, what a ministry we can have if we simply follow that and just trust that God is arranging these things, and that every meeting is sacred. Every moment is holy.
Yes.
Who knows what God is going to do? And these are things where we're just trusting that somehow God will show us it all. This is the parts of the tapestry we don't see, where we may bring a word of encouragement and never hear another word about it, may not know what that did to somebody. And yet again, we're trusting that this is the way God works.
Yes. Yes. I have started kind of a new practice that has just been very helpful to me. But every morning when I get up, I just crawl, basically kind of roll out of bed onto my knees and just lift my hands to him and say, the day is yours. Like, you lead me and just show me where you want me today. And it's just such a comforting start to my day. And
that's lovely.
It's beautiful how he then shows up and it goes right back to, okay, you used me there, or I saw you there. It's a beautiful opportunity. Tim, as we kind of wrap up here, how would you say that you have experienced Jesus even through the deepest pain?
Yeah, I think just these things we've been talking about, to be honest, I've experienced the Lord through his Spirit, through his word, through his people. And these are exactly, I think, the expectations we should have all the time, every day. We don't necessarily look for the miraculous or those other things. God works through his ordinary means day by day. And so the local church has been really just such a tremendous blessing. The pattern of worship, meeting with God's people, sacraments, ordinances, singing good songs, all this has just been so precious to us. And then just interacting with God's people, reading his word, praying our sorrows to him in all honesty, and then just receiving his comfort has been exactly what I guess I would have thought that, because that just seems to be how God works. And he's proven that over the last couple of years. Awesome.
Is there anything on your heart as we close out that you want to speak to a listener here?
Yeah, I suppose just sort of returning to some of the themes we've been talking about is just bowing the knee to God in our sorrows. And if God is really sovereign in this world, if he's really the king of this world, then he's the king of our sorrows too. And that means, truly evil people can do truly evil things in this world, but somehow even these don't happen apart from the sovereignty of God. So somewhere in there, we have to receive even the hardships in life in such a way that we say, I don't understand it, but God, I'm trusting you with it. And so, living with that awareness of his providence is so important, so precious, and brings tremendous meaning to our sorrows, because we know if God decreed this or God permitted this, then God's in it somehow. He's got something for me in it. And I'm just going to turn this around in love and service to others, and, live with confidence, live by faith, and just live out my short little walk here and go off to be with the Lord and just see what he's going to do with it all.
Amen. Tim, thank you seriously for being here, for being vulnerable. I mean, I am sure it brings up pain. It's challenging to share this. It's not, but thank you for being willing to share this. And I appreciate you being on today.
Thank you.
Well, I hope that today's episode encouraged you wherever you are on your foster care journey. We want you to stay connected, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you will never miss an episode. Also, we have great content at theforgotteninitiative.org. Thank you for watching. I cannot wait to be with you next time.